Hey folks, welcome to Moonshift Audio. I've been following UK duo Overmono since their excellent Rough Living EP caught my eye in 2018, and if you ask me, they've been going from strength to strength since then. By the time their first full-length album, Good Lies, came out last year, they had already established themselves as a force to be reckoned with in the UK scene, and with their recent collaboration with Fred again and Lil Yachty, they absolutely smashed it. Stay In It is without a doubt my track of the year so far. Last week I showed you how to make the lead sound from that track, and this week I'm going to walk you through a full production. I'm not trying to recreate the exact sound of Stay In It, but I'm taking elements from that kind of production, as well as some of the kinds of sounds that have distinguished Overmono over the last few years. Here's a preview of what we'll be making. Before we get stuck into this production, I'm just going to introduce myself quickly. My name's Jack and I'm a UK-based producer and mix engineer. I put out a new video every week, so please do like and subscribe. If you want to make UK rave-influenced music like this and you're interested in working with me, you can get in touch with me at moonshiftaudio.com or leave a comment down below. But for now, let's jump into Cubase. Alright, so here we are in Cubase. Let's take a look at this track, and as usual, I'm going to start with the drums. Now, Overmono have a very distinctive drum sound, and the word that I would use above all else to describe it is gritty. So we're going to be using a lot of saturation, a lot of distortion in some cases, and a few other little tricks just to get this sounding really nice and raw. So I'm going to solo the drums, and we can take a listen to them in the intro. So the first thing I did, as I often do, is hit up Splice, find a few, in this case, garage style kick drums, and I threw them into a battery. So I got these. And actually, I ended up going with the first one that I found, but I did quite a lot of processing on it to get it sounding how I wanted. So if I just turn off all the effects on that kick drum, that's a much more traditional sort of garage sound. And the big effect that I found loads of use for on this track is the new version of Trash from Isotope / Native Instruments. And I just used this preset called Lo-Fi Beat, which I tweaked a bit. It's a multi-band distortion, this, and I'm mainly working here on the mid-band. And just to give you an idea, here's without any effects at all. And now with the Trash. Really beefing that up, really adding a lot of harmonics. I pulled up a Pro Q3 just to boost the fundamental, the real subsection of that kick, pull out some mud. And I also used a shelf just to pull out the real rumble. So here's that without the EQ. And now with. Just here it's tightening it up, adding even more weight there. I was finding that particularly with the distortion, was really bringing out the tail of that kick, and I wanted it to be a bit more punchy, so I'm just using this envelope shaper to pull back the release by about 6 dB. So here's without. I'll bring it in. And without. And with. You should be able to hear just that. It's not so boomy anymore. It's just a bit more snappy and punchy. So the last thing I've got on this kick is a limiter, which isn't something I often use on drums, but it can be really useful. And I got this Pro L2 on the aggressive style, and I'm actually limiting pretty hard. So you can see here, taking off 6.5 dBs. That's without. It's basically, at this stage, almost like another flavor of distortion, and it's just making that kick incredibly solid. And it gives it a real kind of knock. With the kick done, we can take a quick look at the clap and the snare, which I've just bust out on the same output. So again, I loaded in a few options to play with. Some rim shots. Ended up going with that one. And a few claps. And I ended up for my main snare sound using this clap and that rim. So the first effect on here is another instance of trash. This is without any effects. And if I bring in the trash, you can see I'm not taking advantage of the multi-band capabilities. This is just a gentle sort of saturation that I program myself based off the initial preset. I'm doing a little bit of EQ, not loads, just rolling off the subs and a little bit of the highs. I'm putting a little bit of a mid-range boost in just to kind of bring this clap snare more into the mid-range. So here's without that EQ. And with. Just tames it a bit. These drums aren't going to be sparkly. They're not going to be super sizzly, snappy. The whole thing is supposed to be quite lo-fi and gritty. So we don't want that super sparkly high end on any of these elements really. Lastly, I'm using another limiter on the clap in aggressive mode. And again, just basically distorting that. It's a nice flavour of distortion that you get from a limiter like that. One of the last things I got out of the battery was some rim shots, and I just used these other ones that I'd pulled in before. And a couple of the other claps. Again, I've thrown a trash on there, pretty basic kind of saturation. A little bit of the convolve module, which adds a kind of space that I really like to these drums. It's quite lo-fi sounding. And I'll just play a little loop of these without the trash. And with. Really nice distortion there. These are going to the same reverb as the snare. I just made this drum reverb, and it's quite big actually. I'm doing the usual, rolling off the lows and highs before we go into the reverb itself, but I'm using this dark room with a 1.3 second decay time, a little bit of a pre-delay, which actually is quite an audible sort of verb on those drums. I bring it back in on the clap snare. It's lovely. Overmono make some really nice use of samples, and particularly little things to layer up with their drums. So I've just pulled in a couple of samples that I got off a splice. Just turn off the effects here. Now these effects are actually from a video game sound effects pack, but actually I found that they worked really nicely just to sit behind the snares. I'm using an RC20 to distort, add a little bit of noise, and do quite severe filtering. So if we listen to it with that, it's quite subtle. But if I bring in the rest of the drums, and now I'll bring in these vocals, without, just adds a nice little bit of texture and a little bit of source to that snare, a bit of character. We're getting into the sort of top loops now, the percussion loops. And again, I just got a few loops off a splice. And if I undo the trimming that I did on this sample, you'll hear this shaker loop in its entirety. I'll turn off the effects. So it's quite a high energy sort of thing, but it's just a bit too much. So the first thing I did was put a little fade in at the start, trim some bits out. And then I really went to town with some effects. So I threw an Echo Boy on there, just to give it a little bit of a wash. Decapitator. Driving it quite hard, crunching it up a bit. Then this is where we really thin it out. Again, I don't want those sparkly highs. I'm just using the mid-range, kind of upper mid-range, and rolling off all the lows. I used stage 1 from Leapwing to throw it out into the stereo field, trying to keep it out of the way of the other hats that are in the middle. And I dropped a compressor on there, which is being sidechained off the kick. Bring in those snare vocals. we're getting quite a nice background to the beat now. And before we go any further, I'm just going to show you the other top loop that I use, which was a hi-hat loop. So we'll just listen to that. Again, I've done a lot of chopping up of this. Turn off the effects, and I'm going to stretch it out so we can hear how that was when it arrived. Quite a classic kind of garage, really heavily swung. But again, it's too much with the other parts. It's just more than we like to have going on with this. So, trimming out different sections, a few little fade-ins and fade-outs. Just sits much nicer with the rest of those drums now. We'll just have a quick look at the processing that I put on this hi-hat loop. I threw a trash on there, and in this instance you can really hear the convolve module. Almost like adding a kind of distorted reverb to that. Decapitator. Crunching it up even more. Then I put on an envelope shaper just to emphasize the attack. Not much. Just wanted to get a little bit more sharpness out of the transient on those hats. And then a Pro Q3, thinning them out, really removing all of that shiny top end and of course all the lows. So this is without the effects. And with. Last element of the drums that comes in after a 16 bar is another program thing. It's the last sample that I loaded into this battery, and it's a closed 808 hat. Now the pattern that I programmed for this, done quite a lot with the velocities, and you can see that I've got this on a 49% swing, which is pretty extreme. You get this lovely syncopation. Got a little bit of EQ on here, just taking off the very top end. You can hear it's just a bit too shiny, a bit too bright. And I'm sidechaining that to the kick drum. So if we play all those drums together. Got a really nice groove going on there. Pull this up. Get those vocal hits back in. Should send them to the drum bus. Speaking of which, I'm using iHeartNY, the Baby Audio parallel compression plugin, to add some extra grit here. So I'll play this just as it was, dry. Now if I bring in the parallel signal, adding some volume there, but I don't mind that, and just gritting it up a bit. And that's our drums. The first melodic element that comes in right from the top of this arrangement is a long sustained note on the bass. And the bass is made up, in this case, of two separate parts, a high part doing the mid-range and a low part, which is doing the sort of body and the sub. So we can take a look at this high bass. I start with this really long sustained note. And this is a pretty basic patch. It's made with two detuned oscillators, so if I turn off one, that's the high part left, and the low part. You can hear obviously quite a lot of modulation on the filter from an LFO. And that's kind of it. Obviously I have got some processing going on, so I'll pull that off. I've got a chorus, the classic Juno style chorus from Arteria. I've got trash, I really went to town with on this project. This convolve module is just fantastic. Adds so much character. I'm throwing it into a Pro Q3, rolling off the lows because we've got the sub coming in beneath this and some of the muddiness here. And then I'm getting an RC20, and what I'm using here is mainly the wobble with a bit of flux which adds some randomness. And you can just hear it drifting, which really helps with this kind of gritty lo-fi feel that we're trying to get with this production. I made some really good use of RC20's wobble feature in this. You can see here we start off pretty static, and I'm just doing a very gentle increase on that filter frequency, and then the more depth, the amount of wob that we're getting off that LFO comes up here, and then we drop back down again. So this is just giving us a nice little bit of rising energy through these 16 bar sequences in the intro. We also bring in a pad, pretty straightforward. It comes from the Oberheim, I think, in Analog Lab, and it sounds like this. I'm using RC20 just again to add some wobble, some distortion, just some general kind of grit to it. Pulling out the lows and the low mids with a Pro Q3. And then I wasn't quite getting the control that I wanted over all of this, particularly after the distortion on the RC20. So I pulled in this Moog filter plugin. It's from UAD. I really like the sound of this. Putting a bit of drive in as well, so it roughs it up even further. And it's basically just a low pass filter. And what I'm using it for is to slowly bring that in. So you can see I've automated the cutoff. And if we come back to here, just hear that gently fading in. Last element of the intro is the vocals. So I got this sample, I think, from a Loop Masters garage pack that I bought quite a few years ago now. But it's nice to return to it, actually. I haven't worked in this style for a while. And if I just mute all the inserts, because I've done quite a lot on this.
I'm crazy for your love. I'm crazy for your love.
We play that in the mix.
Crazy for your love.
I think I might have pitch shifted this.
I'm crazy for your love.
Just a little bit to get it to fit the key of the track. But I've done a lot more processing than that. So, first up, Little Altar Boy, pitching it up and formatting it down.
Crazy for your love.
Bit of drive there.
Crazy for your love.
So that's just to give it that slightly odd formant shifted quality and also a bit of grit. We are pulling out the lows.
Crazy for your love.
With a Pro Q3.
Crazy for your love.
Greenhouse, which is a nice plugin for
Crazy for your love.
adding a bit of Hass effect, that sort of slightly delayed left and right channel, throwing it out to the sides.
Crazy for your love.
Echo Boy.
Crazy for your love.
That's on a dotted quarter, and I actually at this point split the track because I wanted a different delay time. You can hear on the other sample.
I'm crazy for your love.
That's a straight quarter note delay. Going back to this original one. Roomworks, just a basic reverb. Pretty wet, 40%.
Crazy for your love. Crazy for your love.
Now, Overmono put a lot of chorus on their vocal samples, and by throwing the chorus after the reverb, you can really kind of like modulate those reverb tails. It's a great way of getting a really kind of spaced out sound.
Crazy for your love.
Again, I'm using the Juno 6 chorus. Full mix. I've put it on manual mode with quite a fast rate.
Crazy for your love.
Compression.
Crazy for your love.
Really slamming that.
Crazy for your love.
Helps just to kind of fatten up those reverb tails.
Crazy for your love.
Kind of reins it all in a bit, flattens it out nicely. Another EQ.
Crazy for your love.
Just after that chorus, now that we've kind of got the sound how we want it, taking out any more lows and putting a big high shelf on.
Crazy for your love.
And now a stereo enhancer,
Crazy for your love.
just to make it slightly less wide actually. I found it was just a bit too, it felt a bit artificial. I think with a lot of the stuff in this kind of track, it's easy to get too fancy, too shiny, too overblown, when actually a lot of what makes these things so magic is the subtlety that they have, being a bit restrained. So here is my vocal sample in the mix.
Crazy for your love. I'm crazy for your love.
So I think that's pretty close to the way that Overmono like to process their samples. But for this track, I actually decided that it's a bit too dry. And so although I don't think Overmono would do it this way, I just slapped a Valhalla Vintage Verb on the vocal bus, 100% wet, on a Hall preset. I like the way it washes it out, sends it back a bit in the mix, makes it a bit less distinct. I think it just works for this track. And now we're into the breakdown. The pad is now playing some chords. And you probably heard there the subs come in. So we'll have a quick look at that. Again, this is a pretty basic patch. I'm just using one oscillator with the triangle and sawtooth waves, and that same quarter note triplet LFO, just doing literally two very gentle modulation on the cutoff. Not too much processing on this, but I am using a FabFilter Satin to put quite a lot of drive on, and you can hear that's without, and it's just roughing it up, and it will also really help that cut through on smaller speakers. I'm pulling a little bit of the low end out, and this is just actually something that I've automated for the breakdowns. You can see here, this is the gain on that low band of the Pro Q3. If I skip forward a bit, as the breakdown continues and we're trying to suck some energy out so that we can chuck it all back in when it drops, just pulling that band gain back so we're left with just the mid-range of the bass. And I didn't want to start with it fully in. I wanted the first time that you feel the full power of that low end to be when the track drops, which is why when we first encounter this sub bass, we were already taking a few dBs out of the low end. Lastly, I'm sidechaining it to the kick drum so that when we get to the drop, we get this nice push-pull swinging energy around the kick. So at this point, the low and the high bass are both playing the same part. But you can hear I've just put some gaps in the high bass part, which just helps to stop it getting too much of a drone. It's nice to put some gaps in where you can feel the energy, where the drums can come through. And the last thing I did just to build into the track is a roll on the kick drum. And you can see I actually straightened out the snapping on the grid for this. I didn't want it to be a syncopated roll. I just want it to be a straight kick roll. And now we're into the track itself. Doubled up the frequency of those vocal samples. But everything else is pretty much as it's been introduced before. to the next section, I just brought in a sort of variation on the high bass. So the pad comes back in, and you can see I've got this bass high stabs, and this is basically the same patch as that high bass, but I've raised the notes up an octave, and I've dropped in a arpeggiator. This Apache, this has been in Cubase for years. This is mostly the same processing, but I did throw on a shaper box, which is doing some panning. So this is without. I'll bring it in. It's just a nice way to bring a bit of stereo interest, and I threw an echo boy on there just to space that out a bit, and of course scooped out even more of the low end, because I've effectively made this into a lead synth now, or at the very least a mid-range one. So although I based the drums on Stay In It, I'd say the overall flavour of this track is a bit more chilled out, like a lot of Overmono's other recent material. But I couldn't resist going into a bit of a 4 to the floor section like we do here on Stay In It. So I'm just going to let this roll into the next section. You can see here, everything drops out, all the drums. And I just bring that new section in. So we'll take a look at the drums. Not that much has changed here in terms of the actual instrumentation, but obviously the beat is quite different. For the kick, got that main slamming 4 to the floor groove, but also some ghost notes and some slightly less ghosty notes, which just really help to give it a nice bit of swing, nice bit of energy. And it's a good time to show you what I've done with the side chaining on this. Now, if I play this drum here, this is actually a hi-hat sample, and you can see here it's coming out on this side chain trigger. I bust it out onto its own output. If we look in the mixer, the volume is all the way down. If I turn it up, and the reason I've done that is because I didn't want to hear it, but I did want something useful to trigger all the side chains that I've got, the various compressors. The reason I've done this is because with a big kick drum like this, it's actually quite a long sample, and you lose control on your compressors if you're triggering it with quite a long sample. For example, if you wanted something to just duck out the way quite quickly, like, for example, the bass in the earlier section, bring in that trigger now. If we look at this compressor, this blue meter is the incoming sidechain signal. It's just there and gone in a flash. And I was able to choose my own release and attack settings for this to get it grooving just how I wanted it. Whereas with the kick drum sample coming through straight, I would have struggled to make that as snappy as it currently is. It also then allows me the flexibility when we get to the end bass. If I want to, have a bit more of a classic kind of techno pumping effect. And even more importantly, it allows me to not trigger the compressor from these ghost notes. You can see that this hi-hat sample that I'm using to trigger the compressors is only there on the quarter notes, whereas the actual kick drum itself has got all these ghost notes. I'm trying to get that nice sort of sucking out, that push-pull kind of almost trancey ducking on the bass. And I don't want it bouncing up and down with all of these ghost notes. So having a separate trigger is really, really handy. I've given up the rim shot, so we're only using the clap. The 808 hats are there. Dropped out those vocal hits, and I brought in a couple of additional percussion elements. So I got some wood blocks here. I made another battery for this. And I wanted to kind of give these a bit of more of an interesting character. So here's how they were dry. So I dropped on a Moog filter, a slightly bigger version of that same plugin. And this one's got an envelope on it. So if I just turn the resonance right up, we're detecting that incoming audio and just giving a little bit of a sweep. Now we don't need it as much as that, but we've driven it a bit here as well, and then thrown a decapitator on with a bit of a tone shift, pulling it down into a darker sort of balance of frequencies. Just much more interesting sound now, a lot more gritty, which fits the territory. And I got a sample of a ticking clock off a splice, and I just threw that on the offbeats. You can see I filtered out particularly the low end and a little bit of the highs. And it's just another nice, I could have thrown another sample in there, or a hi-hat or something like that, but a bit of a Foley sound, like a real world sound, it's just always going to be a bit more interesting. So I'll play it without. And now with. Just really helps to add just that little bit of extra urgency, a little bit of an extra lift when we get to this part of the track, when we really want to go kind of balls out, really. The last thing I've done here is mess around a bit more with this vocals. So I'm just going to extend this out of the bit that I chopped out, bypass all the effects.
I'm crazy for your love.
And you'll hear what I've basically taken is just the love word.
Love, love.
A lot of this is the same processing from the original samples. Got the Alter Boy, Pro Q3, Greenhouse, Echo Boy, Roomworks. And then I started to get a bit more creative. So I pulled in Rift Filter Lite, which is a kind of slightly fruity dual filter that gives you a morph control. This is a free plugin. There's a full version, which looks like a lot of fun, but this free version does still give you quite a lot of things to play with. You can hear it's doing some interesting things. So I got the spread on max, which is panning the dual filters left and right. I've thrown a chorus on there, just to modulate it all a bit. Compressor. Just wanted to level out particularly those resonance spikes that this filter's causing. Really, that's like a ridiculous amount of compression really, but it sounds alright to me, so I'm happy with it. Slightly overloading that, don't care. This is that same EQ kind of tilting out, putting a little bit of sizzle on. The same stereo enhancer to bring it back into the middle slightly. And then shape a box. And this is, I'm just using this on a very, very quick square wave to chop that filter up and down. And you can see here I modulate, or rather increase, the mix on that. So as we get further through, that chopping effect becomes more pronounced. Drop that out, and we can have a look at what I've been doing here on the main bass. So this is the high bass, and I really wanted this to kind of like morph and change. So I've been playing around with these two pads that they're like XY pads. You can change what's in the corners of them. And you can see here, I mean, this is some quite extreme automation. If I play this, you'll see what I did. I just recorded this with the mouse. Be like on the mid band. Just really nice way to just get a kind of real morphing, twisting, changing tone. You could do this by diving into the synth itself. Particularly if you were using a synth like Serum with like all sorts of really interesting LFO shapes and modulation capabilities. Diva isn't really built for that kind of modern sound, so being able to do it after the fact with a plugin like this is brilliant. And I reckon that's just about it. Thanks for watching, folks. That's it for this week. If you found this video useful, please do like and subscribe for more tips, tricks, resources and downloads from me at Moonshift Audio. Till next time.